I'm going to introduce both of the next two speakers now for reasons that will become apparent a bit later. First, it is my great pleasure to welcome Linda Wolk-Simon, curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she has worked in varying capacities since 1986. Linda is an expert on Raphael and his workshop, especially the important painter and draftsman Perino del Vaga, and has written extensively about Italian drawings of the 16th century. Many of you will remember her and know of her from her recent jewel of an exhibition here, Raphael at the Metropolitan, the Colonna altarpiece, in 2006, and from her groundbreaking contribution to the exhibition Painters of Reality of 2004, in which she examined the subject of naturalism in Lombard drawings of the 16th and 17th centuries. She's the curator of the second section of the current exhibition, Profane Love, and today will speak on aspects of the subject of her essay in that catalog. Her talk today has the provocative title, Sex in the Eternal City, Art and Love in Renaissance Rome. But now, let's please welcome Linda Wolk-Simon.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon. In the intellectually sophisticated milieu of Renaissance Rome, as elsewhere in Italy in the 16th century, in the decades before the Counter-Reformation, the sacred and the profane were not distinct or separate realms. Rather, they were two aspects of a single, seamless culture. Both proceeded from a learned immersion in classical antiquity, which offered paradigms both lofty and low. The humanists who revered and emulated the noble prose of Cicero also devoured the racy texts of Ovid and the humorous, satiric dialogues of Lucian. The artists who studied the Apollo Belvedere and the Laocoon in an effort to revive that noble, heroic manner found that the ancient Romans had indulged in equal measure their taste for less elevated fare. Scenes of heterosexual and homosexual lovemaking were commonplace in Roman wall painting and also frequently appeared on small-scale decorative objects such as cameos, silver, pottery, and oil lamps, not to mention monumental sculpture as well. Like the monumental architectural and sculptural remains, these miniature and often fragmentary relics of classical antiquity were keenly studied by Renaissance artists and humanists, particularly in Rome, where such material was constantly augmented by new archaeological discoveries. Such antique exemplary both fueled and sanctioned their enthusiastic embrace of lewd imagery, which could be justified, however speciously, as a learned revival of the maniera all'antica. Some of the most rhetorically elevated, learned, and refined works of Renaissance art and literature were produced by painters and poets who turned their energies with equal facility to lewd, salacious, and erotic subject matter. Artists like Giulio Romano, Perino del Vaga, Francesco Salviati, and Parmigianino, the artists you see on the screen here, decorated sacred liturgical spaces with decorous frescoes and altarpieces at the same time that they were exploring in their drawings more earthy subjects like fornication and pederasty. Marcantonio Raimondi, Raphael's gifted engraver who reproduced that master's most brilliant pictorial inventions, was also responsible for some of the most sexually explicit and transgressive prints ever produced, including the engraving on the right, known today only in a single impression. We really wanted this for the show, but it was vetoed by the powers that be. Cesare di Sesto, a talented follower of Leonardo da Vinci from Milan, who spent a number of years in Rome, drew standing saints next to copulating figures on the same page, on a sheet from one of his sketchbooks. And the poet and curial secretary, Francesco Berni, a learned humanist, penned an ode to his urinal and rhapsodized in verse about the pleasures of sodomy, while the painter Bronzino, who was also a gifted poet, found erotic inspiration in his paintbrush and frying pan. I'm going to say more about this dish later. It's in the show, and it's one of my favorite objects. If such innocuous objects as a paintbrush and a frying pan strike a modern audience as dull muses, contemporaries conversant with the burlesque lexicon of the day would have immediately recognized the phallic and sodomitic references encoded in his witty encomia. In the Renaissance, as in antiquity, the theme of illicit carnal love thus provided an endless font of inspiration. Some of the images in question are unabashedly vulgar and lurid in their portrayal of licentious themes, while others explore erotic subject matter with learned erudition. And informing many is a parodic, burlesque sensibility that mocks or satirizes with wit and humor more intellectually elevated modes of literary discourse and artistic display. Regardless of the individual note each of these drawings, paintings, and objects strikes, what most have in common, and this is a point to keep in mind when you're looking at this section of the exhibition, is that they were made for private rather than public consumption. They were meant to be enjoyed by a privileged audience, be it a single individual or a select few gathered behind the protective walls of a villa, studiolo, or academy. An exception here, of course, is prints, which were meant to be widely disseminated and had the capacity to circulate scandalous imagery to a vast, uncontrollable audience, and it's for this reason that they were frequent targets of censorship campaigns. And like the ancient sculpture of a nude Venus described by the satirist Pietro Aretino, that most vocal and prurient champion of erotic love who we'll hear from throughout this lecture, like that Venus, erotic images were not intended to incite the viewer to virtuous thoughts or noble deeds. Rather, their purpose was to arouse pure lust. In renouncing all, quote, Petrarchan subtleties, Aretino's lusty heroine, the prostitute Nana, announces not only the essence of profane love, but also of profane art in the Renaissance. There's no better locus to set the stage than the glorious suburban villa on the west bank of the Tiber in Rome, known as the Villa Farnesina. It was built by the papal banker Agostino Chigi, the wealthiest man in Rome, as a pleasurable retreat for himself, the courtesan who would eventually become his wife, and his learned and cultivated friends and intimates. Designed by the Sienese painter and architect Baldassare Peruzzi in the first decades of the 16th century, Chigi's villa was in every way, to quote the Renaissance historian Ingrid Rowland, a sexy place. On the walls of the patron's bedroom, Alexander the Great greets his beautiful mistress Roxanne in a fresco by the Sienese painter Sodoma. His nickname, he's known as Il Sodoma, the sodomite, was a reflection of his particular sexual proclivities. In the Loggia of Galatea, the giant Polyphemus, by the Venetian painter Sebastiano on the left, gazes with longing across the room at Raphael's comely sea nymph, Galatea, the image on the right. In the gardens of the Chigi villa, there stood in the 16th century a sculpture of Cupid and Psyche, and another of a satyr seducing a boy. These may not be those precise works, but certainly exemplify these themes, personifications of homosexual and heterosexual modes of love. And in the garden loggia, love, quite literally, was in the air. There, Raphael and his pupils, summoning a cast of beautiful, sensuous nudes, portrayed in the spandrels and ceiling compartments the legend of Cupid and Psyche. This mildly salacious ancient fairy tale, narrated in a poem known as The Golden Ass, recounts the story of the illicit love of Cupid and the mortal nymph Psyche, which culminated after many trials with a splendid marriage celebration attended by the Olympian deities. Lush garlands of naturalistic vegetation, abounding with an endless variety of suggestively shaped fruits and vegetables, frame the narrative scenes. While these are most obviously befitting decorative elements, alluding to Chigi's famously lush gardens just outside the then open loggia, there are also erotic visual puns that reiterate the narrative's profane and amorous content. Bless you. In one conspicuous passage, in case you didn't see it yourself, a sexual encounter is parodied by a lush yielding fig and a swollen zucchini. a playfully nude detail highlighted by the expansively and unsubtly gesturing Mercury below. Numerous birds populate the ceiling, most of whom play no part in the narrative. These may also have been recognized as erotic metaphors, uccello, bird, being slang then and now, as we heard from Dora, for the same part of the male anatomy more graphically represented by the aggressive zucchini. Such coded references to ribald themes are ubiquitous in Renaissance burlesque poetry and imagery, as we'll see, and they would have been immediately appreciated and understood by a 16th century audience. The doings of the inhabitants of the Chigi villa mirrored the amorous themes of its decoration. It was here, in 1519, that Agostino Chigi wed his considerably younger mistress, Francesca Ordeaschi, then pregnant with their 5th child. He had taken up with her after the death of a prior paramour, the celebrated Roman courtesan Imperia. Their lavish marriage ceremony was attended by a retinue of cardinals. This, by the way, is a beautiful portrait by Sebastiano del Piombo. It was recently suggested that the subject here may be, in fact, Francesca Ordeaschi. The lavish marriage ceremony was attended by a retinue of cardinals and presided over by the Epicurean Pope Leo X, an occasional, if rather dull guest at Chigi's legendary banquets, who had insisted on the nuptials. Here, too, according to Vasari, the biographer and painter who Dora mentioned in her lecture, and who's an important source of information on the lives of 16th century painters and artists, here, too, at the Chigi villa, according to Vasari, the amorous Raphael, on the left in a late self-portrait, whiled away languorous hours with his own inamorata, who his impatient but indulgent patron had expediently installed at the villa to entice the philandering painter to report to work. And there is an image of the woman who we believe is she on the right, more about her in a moment. The judgmental biographer, Vasari, in fact, blamed Raphael's sudden and untimely death at the age of 37 on that amorous nature. Following a night of intemperate carousing and romantic excess, the painter contracted a fever to which he succumbed a few days later. And taking in the entire spectacle was a recent addition to Chigi's household, an ambitious but as yet unknown newcomer to Rome named Pietro Aretino, whose salacious verses and dialogues embody the erotic pulse of the 16th century. Ancient and modern Rome, Raphael, Giulio Romano, Giovanni da Udine, and Pietro Aretino, mistresses and courtesans, humanists, poets and prelates, lascivious satyrs and amorous gods, pleasant gatherings with learned and amusing friends, salacious images intended for private rather than public consumption, the profane poetry of classical antiquity, refined erudition, illicit love and carnal pleasure, abundant wit and bawdy humor, erotic puns and metaphors, with a particular preference for birds, fruits, vegetables, and gardens. In microcosm at the Villa Farnesina is the matrix of personalities and themes that define the profane culture of the Renaissance. I've already said that in Renaissance Rome, erotic imagery was by and large restricted to a privileged audience and viewed or enjoyed in a private, closed space. One such space was a stufetta, or bath, a private sanctuary self-evidently intended for a select few. Few 16th century Roman stufette survive, but the two most important ones that do still exist, commissioned by a pope and a cardinal and both decorated by Raphael's pupils, both house such decoration. On the right, the stufette of Pope Clement VII in Castel St. Angelo, decorated probably around the year 1524. In a lighthearted evocation of the ancient world, these decorations by Giovanni da Udine show the thrones of the Olympian deities littered with their discarded clothing and attributes. And I should say this is in very poor condition, unfortunately. It's really a ghost of its former self, but I just had to show it anyway. Coy rather than salacious, this witty conceit suggests that the gods and goddesses have undressed and descended nude into the papal bath. The upper walls are embellished with 4 scenes featuring a voluptuous Venus, goddess of love. These narratives are culled from Ovid, the same ancient literary source that provided the subject matter for the most important surviving Renaissance stufetta, that of Cardinal Bernardo Dovizi da Bibbiena in the Vatican on the left. and a detail of one of the narratives as reproduced in a print from Raphael's workshop on the right. Its now damaged frescoes, the work of Raphael's pupils, principally Giulio Romano, are more provocative in their portrayal of the nude Venus in a variety of alluring poses, such as that on the right. Would not such imagery have been a source of agitation for a celibate prelate, not to mention indecorous for a location within the sacred precinct of the Vatican? Well, in Renaissance Rome, spiritual pursuits were not always the first calling of princes of the church, who frequently lived in an opulent splendor rivaling or surpassing that of secular rulers or princes. Moreover, we should also keep in mind that the decorations of this private space were accessible only to a restricted audience, in the same manner that a mistress portrait or an erotic drawing were intended for private consumption rather than public display. And finally, the dichotomy between sacred and erotic was not as pronounced in the first half of the 16th century as it would come to be following the implementation in Rome of the decrees of the Council of Trent, a series of reforms of the Catholic Church intended to respond to the damaging assaults launched by Protestants in the North. Indeed, the sacred and the profane were often a seamless continuum in Rome in the early decades of the 16th century. Visual testimony of this exists in the rather incongruously erotic and sensual religious images produced by artists who had experienced the licentious and libertine culture of Rome in the 1520s. Works like Parmigianino's Madonna della Rosa on the left and Rosso Fiorentino's Dead Christ with angels on the right. Mistresses, courtesans, and prostitutes, nebulous and often interchangeable categories, figure prominently in the profane culture of Renaissance Rome. The literary paradigm is Pietro Aretino's Nana, the worldly wise puttana, or whore, who has seen, heard, and done it all. In her conversations with her daughter Pippa, who she's training to be an honest courtesan, Nana herself distinguishes between these categories and advises how the enterprising Pippa and other practitioners can move up through the ranks to transform themselves from a puttana to a cortigiana. This portrait of a nude woman by Raphael, known as the Fornarina, almost certainly represents the artist's mistress. The fact that Raphael was betrothed to the niece of the powerful Cardinal Bibbiena, patron of the Stufetto we looked at a moment ago, was apparently of little concern to him, and he deftly managed to elude the bonds of matrimony in order to engage in non-conjugal liaisons. As many scholars have observed, Raphael signaled his proprietary ownership of the woman by inscribing his name prominently on her armband. A shutter that once concealed the painting, but all from its intended audience, was a measure of its private and therefore implicitly erotic nature. Such concealment was a convention in the display of mistress portraits. Aretino referred to a portrait of a Donna Amata by Titian that her protective lover installed in his private chamber and kept behind a silk curtain like a reliquary, he said. And Ludovico Capponi, in a portrait by Bronzino, conceals from the prying eyes of all but himself the subject of a portrait miniature, presumably his mistress or lover. The conceit of a lover's yearning for that which is hidden is also a literary trope. Inflamed by lust, Apollo, in Ovid's Metamorphosis, is not content to gaze at Daphne's lovely features, but longs to behold the nymph's flesh beneath her robe, as that which is hidden he deems lovelier, in Ovid's words. This imputing of a heightened erotic content to that which is hidden or concealed, that which can only be revealed by the actively engaged lover voyeur who opens the shutter or lifts the curtain or removes the concealing robes, is a conceit that informs many of the works in the profane love section of the exhibition. Raphael's portrait of his mistress is not only a literal depiction of an actual sitter, however. It's also an image of idealized Platonic beauty. The foliate screen behind her contains branches of laurel, a tree that by its etymology invokes Laura, the beloved of the poet Petrarch, and the archetype of the ideal woman or mistress. Laurel is also a symbol of chastity, a virtue Petrarch extolled in Laura, and that Raphael here imputes to his mistress. Through this artistic act of conjuring his own chaste and virtuous Laura, Raphael is equated with Petrarch. The painter is a poet, and his portrait is an analog of his poetic formulation of beauty as, quote, a certain idea which comes into my head. This is a conceit ascribed, attributed to Raphael, though it's only recorded in a letter written a couple of years after his death, in which the words are assigned to him. His idea, in other words, is a cerebral synthesis of the best features of many, rather than a literal likeness of an individual. This Platonic conceit is a topos reprised from antiquity. According to Pliny the Elder, the painter Zeuxis combined features of the 5 prettiest girls he could find in order to create a sufficiently beautiful portrait of Helen of Troy. And it finds a literary counterpart in the Renaissance in the writings of Raphael's friend, the poet Pietro Bembo, concerning the transcendental power of perfect beauty, an idea that resonates in Raphael's depiction of his ideal beauty. If Raphael and contemporaries like Bembo and Castiglione were captivated by the idea of perfect beauty, it was the carnal real, rather than the abstract ideal, that engaged the creative imaginations of many other artists, poets, and painters and patrons in Renaissance Rome. On this less exalted stage, the roles of Apollo and Apelles, classical paradigms for the poet and the painter, are played not by Bembo and Raphael, but by Pietro Aretino and Giulio Romano. And here they are, both shown a little later in life. On the left, Aretino, a self-avowed anti-Petrarch and sharp-tongued satirist, Aretino was famous for his lewd and scabrous verses, while his friend and collaborator, Raphael's preeminent pupil and heir, Giulio Romano, shown on the right, rather weary-looking near the end of his life, produced some of the most explicitly erotic images of the 16th century. Giulio's portrait of a woman with a mirror patently derives, I jumped ahead too much, from Raphael's Fornarina. And the Fornarina is represented in our exhibition by a very, very faithful and exact replica done perhaps even during Raphael's own lifetime, lest you be deceived that you're looking at the real thing, but it's a very good stand-in. So you'll see these two images juxtaposed in the exhibition. But a number of subtle changes transform the image, Giulio's image on the left, from Petrarchan icon to Renaissance centerfold. Raphael's symbolically charged foliage is replaced by a topographical view of a courtyard with a servant in the distance. No praiseworthy virtues are ascribed to this nude woman, and the poetic ambiguity of Raphael's invention is absent. Giulio's sitter is neither a Platonic formulation of ideal perfect beauty, nor Laura to his Petrarch. Rather, she is, without doubt, a courtesan. Courtesans were essentially high-class prostitutes, as distinguished from ordinary, cheaper puttane, or common prostitutes. They were fixtures in 16th century Italy, particularly in Rome. And I show you two images from a series of prints showing the stations of life of Roman women. And among the 6 stages featured, one is a widow on the left and the other is a courtesan on the right. So they were just really just part of society in Rome in the 16th century, where the institutionalized clerical and nominally celibate culture made for a more open tolerance of such women than in most other Italian cities, at least in the period before the Counter-Reformation. And even after that, in the later 16th century, the civic government of Rome continued to defend their presence against papal opposition, arguing that wealthy prostitutes were both an economic magnet and a source of tax revenue. And to outward appearances, they deceptively resembled honest women, and we can see that from the prints on the screen. Although at times, and more often in Venice, where there were far more numerous sumptuary laws than were ever imposed in Rome, they were either prohibited or solely allowed, depending on the moment, to sport certain kinds of jewels, veils, and ribbons. Famed for their beauty, wit, and refinement, or conversational skills, and often learned, cultured, and well-spoken, many courtesans, like Machiavelli's mistress, Barbara Faccani Salutati, were also accomplished musicians or singers, or gifted poets in the mode of the famous Venetian courtesan Veronica Franco, probably here on the screen, who is both the author of and inspiration for elegant Petrarchan verses. And if a courtesan's talents weren't genuine, she could at least contrive to emulate such polish or refinement by following the instructions of Aretino's Nana to her daughter, the would-be cortigiana onesta Pippa, to, quote, play a little tune you've learnt for fun, hammer at the clavichord, strum the lute, or pretend to be reading Ariosto, Petrarch, or Boccaccio. That the sitter in Giulio's portrait is one such cortigiana or courtesan is communicated by her inviting gesture and seductive body language. Her erotic offering of flesh is in fact part of the stock erotic repertoire, and we see that image repeated like a leitmotif throughout the exhibition. I'm showing you 3 examples here on the screen. And both the precious trinkets on the table beside her, to her right, your left, and the opulent jewels that she wears, not to mention certain kinds of expensive pieces of clothing, such as silk stockings or fabrics like that arrayed on the balcony. These kinds of items were also, in fact, expressly associated with courtesans, as many 16th century written documents and accounts attest. And I'm showing you a piece in the exhibition kindly brought to our attention by Dora's husband, in fact, who believes that this is actually a casket, a jewel case, specifically made for a courtesan because of its very erotic imagery that would have been inappropriate for an honest woman. It's Cupid caressing his mother Venus to her obvious enjoyment. So we were very happy to have that in the exhibition in the section dealing with courtesans. One dazzled foreign visitor to Rome, remarking in 1549 on the city's courtesans, observed that they were decked with jewels as if they were queens. And this courtesan, the woman in this picture, wears precisely that kind of expensive, elaborate jewelry. Carnal commerce, the exchange of sexual favors for material goods, was often the only means through which many women could ever aspire to own such jewels and luxury objects. Nana assures Pippa that she'll eventually get used to whatever unpleasantness comes with their particular line of work. And she says to her, bear in mind that the stench, the snot, the revolting breath, the filth, the habits and language of your lovers are like rancid wine. After drinking it for 3 days, you forget the smell. In other words, all in a day's work. One Hieronima Lena, interrogated by Roman officials in a case involving prostitution, confessed that she had only consented to physical relations with the city's police chief in order to acquire his attractive gold chain. Asked by her neighbor Livia, a carpenter's wife, Hieronima, what would you sooner have, the gold chain he is wearing or him? She promptly replied, I'd sooner have the chain than him. Her client, Valeria, the police chief, seems to have been under no illusions as to the source of his appeal to Hieronima. In testifying about the inception of their liaison, he recounted, I knew her, he means in the biblical sense, because her own mother acted as a go-between and told me that her daughter was in love with my chain. Another erotic painting by Giulio Romano is this monumental Two Lovers. Sadly, it couldn't travel to the exhibition, even though we tried to give the Hermitage flying directions of how they could get it here, if only they would go through Helsinki. So instead, it's represented in our exhibition by a 2-scale blow-up on the wall of the Forbidden Room. He literally portrays an amorous encounter and then parodies that theme through a series of ancillary details and visual puns, and it's a little hard to see. You can see it if you go up to the show to see the blow-up. For example, there on the bedpost is a carved relief of a satyr, symbol of unbridled physical lust, and a woman, and here an object in the show that takes up this theme of satyrs as representations of lust, a lewd Lilliputian iteration of the main figure's tryst. On the right, a leering crone has unlocked the door and burst into the bedchamber. Chiavare, to turn the key, or to lock, has long been slang for sexual intercourse, and keys themselves, such as those dangling at the woman's waist, carry a similar sexual connotation. 16th century literary wits took up the theme with relish. When one of the characters in the much acclaimed theatrical comedy La Calandria by Cardinal Bibbiena, he of the jilted niece and beautiful bathroom, calls out that the keyhole is full and that the key has been oiled so that it might function better, the audience immediately grasped what was going on behind that closed door. And I'm showing you a print that's a later sort of approximation of the series represented in the show of The Loves of the Gods, where this key motif figures here very prominently. With playful mock erudition, the poet Anton Francesco Doni apothesized this seemingly innocuous household object, acclaiming the key as, quote, the sweetest, most dear, most necessary thing in the world, unquote, and enumerating the towns, Chiavasso, Chiasso, Chiavere, Chiavena, whose names, he claims, derive from their citizens' reverence for the key. Aretino, too, employed the ever-popular key and lock metaphor to connote sexual intercourse. Nana advises Pippa on various effective acrobatics designed to please a client, reminding her to take care not to, quote, let his key slip out of your lock, unquote. These literary confections, like Giulio's painting, display admirable doses of clever wit and humor, much prized elements of the burlesque tradition that contemporaries would have lauded. Giulio's Two Lovers contains another figure or motif from the stock erotic lexicon, that of the voyeur, or voyeurism, one who espies or eavesdrops on the amorous encounter unseen by the lovers. The presence of such a voyeur here, and in other of Giulio's depictions of illicit love, signals the erotic nature of the liaison and heightens its titillation by implicating the spying viewer, in that case you, the person looking at the image, as co-voyeur. Aretino, too, appropriates the idea of the inflamed passions of the unseen observer in his references to voyeurism throughout the dialogues, getting in the occasional anti-clerical dig in the process. Nana recounts, quote, that the big fish in the monasteries and the priesthoods hire courtesans just to watch them being screwed by their rent boys, and it whets their appetites to see them penetrated per alia via, as the epistle says. This drawing by Giulio Romano of an erotic encounter, oh, that's the wrong drawing. This drawing of an erotic encounter, there are lots of erotic drawings by Giulio Romano, of an old man and a young woman presents a witty irony. That irony, the conjoining of antitheses or opposites, such as old and young, beautiful and ugly, into an integral rhetorical or poetic formulation, is the essence of the burlesque paradox, a satiric mode with roots in the ancient author Lucian and epitomized in the Renaissance by the poet Francesco Berni's conception of grotesque beauty. And I'll talk more about him in a bit. Giulio's composition is a sort of visual facetiae, a witty jest in the spirit of the anecdotes of, among others, Poggio Bracciolini and Niccolo Machiavelli, amusing tales involving unlikely lovers, including old husbands and young wives. And of course, leaving aside all literary parallels, the juxtaposition of his face with her rear end, a quintessential display of Giulio's lewd and rather sophomoric humor, would always have been good for a laugh. And here another detail that I just want to show, Giulio's ceiling painting of Apollo and his chariot. Most artists draw that from or depict that from the side. He draws it so that you're looking straight up. And they would have laughed too in the 16th century. Giulio's drawing is close in spirit and subject matter to his designs for the notorious series of prints known as the modi, which loosely translated means the ways or positions, 16 scenes of couples fornicating. These were engraved by Raphael's printmaker Marcantonio Raimondi. And I should say that no original images of these survived. They were censored, and so we know the images through some fragments and through various later copies and reproductions of engravings and woodcuts. And I'm showing you just details of some of the crop fragments as well as the woodcut copies and a later set of images, much later, that still preserve the composition. Pietro Aretino, whose lurid sensibility lurks in these images, authored a series of 16 suitably lewd sonnets that were circulating in Rome at the same time as the prince. He almost certainly had a part in the genesis of the modi. One can in fact imagine him proposing this inspired project to Giulio, his friend from their heady youthful days at the villa of Agostino Chigi. The impressive variety of acrobatic poses that Giulio's figures display, varietà, or variety, was among the most prized of artistic virtues in this period. That range of poses is echoed in the recitation of sexual positions offered by Aretino's Nana. One likes his meat rare, and another likes it well done, and they come up with the horizontal shuffle, legs in the air, side saddle, the crane, the tortoise, the church steeple, the relay, the grazing sheep, and other postures stranger than the gestures of a mime. In a retrospective defense of the modi, Aretino announced, quote, "I reject the furtive attitude and filthy custom which forbid the eyes that which delights them most. What harm is there in seeing a man mount a woman? It would seem to me that the tool nature gave us to preserve the race should be worn around one's neck as a medal, or as a medal in one's hat. It's made you, it's made me. It's produced all the Bembos, the Varchis, the Dolces, the Sansevinos and Titians and Michelangelos. And so we should allocate it to it its own feast days and not enclose it in a scrap of cloth." And looking at the modi, we can be sure that Giulio Romano fully shared these sentiments. Scandalous, sensational, and instantly famous, indeed infamous, the modi were swiftly censored by the irate minions of Pope Clement VII in Rome, led by the austere papal datary Gian Matteo Ghiberti. For his part in the foible, Marcantonio was rewarded with a stint in prison. Aretino also suffered retribution. In the wake of the modi's appearance, he was stabbed, nearly fatally, in Rome, an attack that was almost certainly ordered by Ghiberti, who was already outraged at Aretino's having savagely denounced him as a hermaphrodite. Only Giulio appears to have escaped scot-free, though it's probably no coincidence that he conveniently chose this very moment to accept an invitation from the Duke of Mantua to remove to that provincial malarial backwater. Oh, and one more. And I just wanted to show you that erotic imagery was really, Giulio didn't invent this. And here, for example, is an image from the 15th century, known only in a plate. In the engraver's plate, no prints of this image are even known to survive. So this kind of imagery existed. The problem with the modi was the fact, as I said at the beginning, that they were made as prints that could be reproduced, and their audience could not be controlled. This erotic imagery left the private realm and entered the public realm, and for that reason, they were condemned and judged particularly harshly, and Marcantonio was punished. The modi, here's this drawing now, and many of the other images we've looked up to now deal with heterosexual love, but homosexual love was also very common in Renaissance Rome, not to mention in Florence, where a special government authority, the Ufficio della Notte, or Office of the Night, existed to combat it, and doing it the Florentine way in the 16th century meant sodomy. Also in Venice, where sodomy fell under the jurisdiction of the all-powerful Council of Ten. There it was rampant and punishable by burning at the stake, first alive and then later, more humanely, only after the perpetrator was first beheaded. One offended diarist, writing in 1519, recorded, quote, "This wicked and pernicious vice was openly practiced in Venice without shame, and that it had become so habitual that it was more highly regarded than having to do with one's own wife." Even more shocking, this observer continued, was the fact that this wicked and abominable thing was practiced not just by youth, but also by old men. Unheard of in Venice, he elaborated, and a vice only recently having come from Rome, for the prelates and other old people were given to it, and there were passive homosexuals in the papal court. Homoerotic love is the subject of this drawing by Giulio Romano of Apollo fondling an adolescent male lover, one of two named by Ovid. And this is certainly one of the most explicit Renaissance depictions of this kind of subject. The same theme, for example, was treated by Giulio's fellow pupil in Raphael's workshop, Perino del Vaga, In this drawing, here clearly Apollo and Hyacinth, but there's nothing erotic or sexual, and Hyacinth here really looks more like a struggling toddler. The homoerotic appeal of this provocative image of Cupid carving his bow by Parmigianino is undeniable. It was painted for the artist's friend and patron, the Cavaliere Francesco Baiardo, who owned a number of works having erotic and homoerotic subjects. Portrayed not as a mischievous child, but rather as a fleshy adolescent, Parmigianino's Cupid gazes seductively over his shoulder at the privileged viewer, to whom he presents his shapely and ample rear end. He wields between his thighs a large erect knife. Oops. Here's the knife. A seemingly mundane object that carried overt and specifically phallic connotations in the burlesque humor and imagery of the day. Another homoerotic metaphor drawn from the kitchen cabinet was the frying pan, which the painter Bronzino, who was also a gifted poet, eroticized and extolled in a veiled ode to sodomy. He talked about how if you put eels in a frying pan, they lie there limp, but when you turn up the heat under the frying pan, suddenly the eels spring to life, and I think you got it. Other poets accorded erotic alter egos to a myriad of suggestively shaped fruits and vegetables of the garden. Do I need to point them out? Here's one. And here the fig was a particular favorite. One such literary wit was the poet and curial secretary Francesco Berni, a key figure, I think, for grasping the essence of the comic, satiric, burlesque spirit that informs much of the more profane, bawdy, and erotic imagery of the Renaissance. His poetic formulation of the paradoxical encomium, excessive praise of the exceedingly banal, a rhetorical mode that had its origins in antiquity. Berni's formulation of this paradoxical encomium profoundly influenced burlesque poetry. His encomium to his urinal, certainly the most lowly of objects, is a quintessential demonstration of this burlesque poetic mode. If many of his fellow poets extolled the fig, emblem of female pleasures, as the most perfect fruit, in a sort of erotic paragone or Judgment of Paris, the 16th century poet Francesco Molza announced that the fig was to be prized above rival peaches and apples. Berni instead championed as the most sublime creation the peach, a stand-in for the male buttocks, and, he wryly noted, the favorite fruit of prelates. Quote, "O fruit, blessed above all others, good before, in the middle, and after the meal, good before and perfect behind." This has to be that kind of peach. In a letter to absent friends, the same Berni invokes an eroticized Eden in which the entire garden and everything growing in it alludes to carnal and expressly homoerotic pleasures. Quote, "May God grant you his blessing in giving you for your garden a big thing with a pitchfork as long as a beam between your legs, and may you have beans and pods and peaches and carrots all year round in the way I desire for my small garden." And he actually was accused of sodomy. Unless we wrongly conclude that such erotic double entendres would have been apprehended only by learned literati, it must be remembered that instruction to the population at large existed in the form of popular music. I don't know if I can read this one without laughing, but a well-known Florentine carnival song, Canto dei Cardoni, rhapsodizes about the cardoon. And as you hear it, I'm sure you'll know to what part of the male anatomy it's oh so unsubtly referring to. Ladies, we are master growers of cardoons, which in our gardens grow big and good. We shall give you this recipe of ours, besides which we have no greater gift to give. The cardoon should be in size a span or a little more, for nature cannot digest anything so big and hard, even though we always like big mouthfuls. Well, so much for the cardoon. Horticultural motifs were not the only coded references to sodomy and homoerotic pleasures in the burlesque lexicon, both literary and artistic, of the Renaissance. A more ubiquitous metaphor, and we saw this played already, was the bird, slang in the Renaissance and throughout the ages for the penis, and more specifically in the 16th century, either for that particular part of the anatomy or for the rear end of an accessible boy. The political theorist and playwright Niccolo Machiavelli, in an epistolary novella, employed the bird metaphor to describe the sodomitic appetites of one Giuliano Brancacci, who, believing that every bird was in waiting, went in search of quarry. Enticing a little bird into an alley, quote, he kissed it repeatedly, straightened 2 feathers of its tail, and put the bird in the basket behind him, unquote. The protagonist of this account is a supposedly literary invention who just happens to have the same name as the real Giuliano Brancacci, who's mentioned in letters written to Machiavelli by his friend Francesco Vettori. Machiavelli makes it clear that anyone from a long list of names could be substituted for his fictional bird-loving Brancacci, thereby confirming that bird hunting, or sodomy, was common practice in Renaissance Florence, a reality confirmed in contemporary written documents. I think the bird on this maiolica plate is a metaphor for sodomy, an alternative to the carnal pleasures of female flesh offered by the woman who displays her breasts, a profane gesture of offering, as we've already seen. She attempts to persuade the viewer, a prospective client, one whose natural inclinations might incline more to bird hunting, to sample her particular charms. Such would seem to be the essence of the inscription. Take it and don't regret it. The worst that can happen is you'll have to give it back. Try it, you'll like it. Sodomy is the subject of a parodic, obscene Renaissance dialogue, La Cazzeria, or Book of the Prick, whose speakers discourse earnestly and at length on its manifold pleasures and superior virtues. Appropriating and parodying an elevated literary mode, the Platonic dialogue, to explore a lewd and obscene subject, La Cazzeria partakes of the spirit of the paradoxical encomium, of Berni's apotheosis of his urinal. Its ancient models lie not in Plato's symposium, but in Lucian's satiric dialogues, whose interlocutors, far from discoursing on noble philosophical ideas, get drunk, tell lewd stories, and misbehave. The very title of this Renaissance dialogue, its coarse language, the lengthy and open exploration of sodomy and homoeroticism, the apparent lack of irony with which that subject is addressed, which is in itself an ironic inversion, and the anthropomorphizing of the male sexual organ all call to mind this extraordinary maiolica plate decorated with the profile head of a man made up entirely of phalluses. And this is in the exhibition. I'm sure you're all going to rush up there the second I'm done and go, look at it. In a quintessential burlesque parody, a stock motif from the maiolica painter's repertoire, the idealized head, we saw many of those in Dora's lecture, is here utterly transformed. The banderole, which typically bears an inscription explicating the painted subject or identifying him in some way, here expresses, with the same mock erudition and lack of irony as the protagonist of the dialogue La Cazzeria, this eroticized Archimboldo's wonderment, quote, everybody looks at me as though I am a dickhead. That is what it says. I had so much fun working in this exhibition. And the next one, what could compare to this? I have to go back to saints and altarpieces. It's so boring. We can only guess at the circumstances that led to the production of this plate. But it's not difficult to imagine its amusing presence at the racy and raucous gatherings of humanist secretaries, poets, and painters, the learned, inventive, witty fellows who formed the many academies, sodalities, and more informal supper clubs that sprang up in Rome and elsewhere in the Renaissance. It was presumably for such a closed sodality, or one belonging to it, a sodality whose members shared a taste for learned eroticism, that this kind of learned but erotic object, or a drawing such as this by Francesco Salviati, would have been produced. That homoerotic attachments were both celebrated in verse and practiced by various members of many such fraternities, one such being the Humanist Academy of Pomponio Leto, the famous Accademia Romana, was widely known. Machiavelli was told about one young poet in Rome who was always to be found in the protective company of 4 puttane, or prostitutes, His correspondent explaining that that was because he worries that because he has a certain reputation for being a poet and that the Roman Academy wants to induct him, that he doesn't want to run any risk of being molested, unquote. Perhaps Salviati's drawing shows a young poet being initiated into the Roman Academy. Whatever the case, such an image, like this composition, also by Salviati, just let your eyes wander across this. I'm not going to explain anything. Would have been a source of titillating amusement to all the Bernese Aretinos and Molzas, as well as to Giulio Romano, Marcantonio Raimondi, Parmigianino, and their fellows. And if all these images strike you as not only prurient and lewd, but also clever and amusing, you fully appreciated the Renaissance sensibility that joined the comic to the erotic, the ironic, and the burlesque. As Cardinal Bibbiena, you all remember his niece and his bathroom and his racy theatrical production, as Cardinal Bibbiena announces in Castiglione's great Renaissance dialogue, The Courtier, the humorous is the things that move us to laughter. Thank you.